One of the main things you're going to need to understand about character development is understanding conflict. External versus internal. Let's start with the basics. Every good story has conflict, and if you want to be in the business of storytelling, then you're going to need to understand the difference between internal and external conflict. Let me reemphasize in case that wasn't clear enough. Conflict is the story. We're going to be saying and repeating conflict over and over and over because that is going to be the key ingredient to having an engaging story. Let's take a step back though and define what conflict itself is in a story. In its simplest terms, conflict is just the struggle between opposing forces. Conflict is what will keep your audience engaged because it's the fuel that keeps your story moving forward. Without some type of conflict, your characters would just be meandering around, just doing random things for random reasons. And who wants to watch 2 hours of that? External conflicts are the obstacles that your character faces in the physical world. Internal conflict would be based more so on their emotional obstacles. In The Matrix, Neo must fight Agent Smith and any other programs like him whenever he is inside the Matrix. That's the external conflict, right? How he struggles with the fact that he is supposedly the one who can save everyone is the internal conflict. His self-doubt. Neo will have to conquer his inner conflict before he can handle the external conflict that requires his physical abilities. Do you see how they're connected? The internal conflict can be a desire, belief, or anything similar where it happens within a character and they have to struggle with it. This will ultimately drive their character arc. The external conflict will be something or someone your character struggles with that stands in the way of their goals, motivations, or their growth. Now, there are several subset types of conflict that we'll discuss in the next video, but they all will fall under external or internal conflict. The two main categories, remember that. To apply external and internal conflict to your story, you will need to make sure that all the conflict is created to oppose your character's overall goal. So if your character wants to get a job out of college to support himself, then most of your conflict and obstacles are going to revolve around preventing him from doing so. For instance, one type of an external conflict scenario could be that his best friend involves him in a crime without a heads up that could land him in jail if they get caught. An inner conflict could be his struggle with how he responds to the police when he's questioned or even blamed for the crime. Should he rat out his friend? Or should he stick to the lie that his friend told him to say? Do you see how this character might struggle internally with that decision? Ultimately, your characters will have to overcome various external and internal conflicts throughout the story for it to move forward. Give your character a goal, and while you're writing your story, always make sure to create conflict in every single scene to keep things moving forward. Without conflict, your story is just going to end up being a long laundry list of events and situations that happen one after another. Character goals. Most great movies have stories where they are based on strong characters who are complex, layered, and are in an active pursuit of some type of goal. You ever notice that? That's because that goal in most cases will be linked directly to their growth, the conflict they struggle with, and any obstacles that arise in the process. The goal doesn't have to be something that is completely over the top or as cliche as saving the world like we always see in every single movie. However, it does need to be that important to your character. In your character's world, preventing a certain corrupt employee from becoming their company's next CEO could be just as important as saving the world to them. In order for the audience to care about your character's goal, there must be a grave impact in the event that your character fails to achieve it. Those are called the stakes. What would have happened if Batman would have failed to stop the Joker in The Dark Knight? In the movie Inception, what would have happened if Cobb would have failed his mission of planting an idea into a CEO's mind using that dream sharing technology? What if the Avengers would have failed at stopping Thanos in the Endgame? There's that saving the whole world thing. Sorry. Anyway, the goal needs to be clear in order to keep your character driven so that the story is always moving forward. Even though your character may want a lot of things, there must always be one primary goal they're dead set on achieving. Let's go over some examples. In the movie Taken, Liam Neeson wants to be in his daughter's life more. Ever since his ex-wife beat him in a divorce custody battle, he wants to make up for lost time from when he was married to his work instead of his wife and missed out on the early years of his daughter growing up. After his daughter gets kidnapped, he now has to save her in order to do that. And that is his goal. It's something that is a clear, physical person, place, or thing that can be seen and understood by the audience. In the movie Maze Runner, the main character has been trapped inside of a maze without his memory, surrounded by a group of others his age. His only goal is to escape. He spends the movie pursuing his freedom. Just that simple. Everything else that comes in his way is conflict, is obstacles. You want to create obstacles and things in the character's way that blocks them from their goal. That's the movie. If we think back to the original Karate Kid movie, the main character was bullied in high school by a group of knuckleheads who all trained at the same karate gym. After learning karate himself, his goal was to beat the main bully in a very popular karate tournament in exchange for a truce. In the television series Breaking Bad, the main character is a 40-something chemistry teacher who's been diagnosed with cancer. He wants to make sure his wife and kids are taken care of financially, so he begins to make meth, partners with a boneheaded ex-student/drug dealer, and sets a goal of achieving $800K by any means necessary. That's his goal. He believes that money is enough to take care of his family when he dies. Remember the movie In the Pursuit of Happiness starring Will Smith? Well, after losing his wife and apartment, the main character must take care of his son. His goal is to secure a job that will not just allow him and his son to barely survive, but will be something he can excel at. In every Batman movie, just about, he has a goal of stopping the main villain. While his overall goal is protecting Gotham, in each movie, it will explore how he must set out to stop a new threat, whether that is the Joker, Bane, or whoever. In the story The Social Network, Mark strives to achieve a goal of starting Facebook. Do you see how simple and straightforward and obtainable these goals are? They seem pretty simple, but for your character throughout the movie, as you develop the plot, you're going to create conflict and obstacles and create stakes that are going to affect how this character goes about achieving the goal. We'll get into that as we move on into the next videos. At the end of the day, everyone wants something in life, even your characters. That is why your character feels more relatable when it's something that the audience can actually understand. I want you to really understand this chapter because your goal is going to be very critical to the plot of the story and everything else that's tied to it. Everything revolves around your character's goal. Keep in mind that your character's goal needs to be something that the camera can actually focus on. In other words, it can't be something like, my character just wants to be happy, or my character just wants to feel better, or something that is abstract that we can't actually see on screen. If you notice, all the examples that I gave is a person, place, or thing. It's something that we can identify with and it makes sense to your particular character. All right, now that you understand the character's goals, let's talk about how you can make sure you have strong goals. And that's going to be by creating high stakes for your character. Character stakes are basically asking the question, what happens if they fail? What is the worst thing that could possibly happen if your character does not achieve their goal? Think about that really hard. It can't just be as simple as they just have a bad day and they're able to shake it off. This should be a matter of life and death, either literally or figuratively speaking for your character, based on the story that they're in. If Liam Neeson's character in the movie Taken fails to save his kidnapped daughter and she dies or is never able to be found, this is something that would make his character feel dead inside. He would never be able to get over it. Maybe even lead up to depression or even suicide, who knows? But we know that he was willing to risk his life to save her. The point is, the goal needs to have serious repercussions for your character if they fail to obtain it. Always ask yourself, why do we care? The higher the stakes are, the more tension and suspense you're able to create in the story. Your character can face external stakes, internal stakes, or philosophical stakes. External stakes would be like the Ghostbusters struggling to stop a full outbreak of ghosts from plaguing the city and eventually the world. Why do we care? Well, if they fail, the world is at stake. Another example that isn't so extreme but still considered high stakes could be the main character's situation in the movie Minority Report. If you remember Chief John Anderton, who was played by Tom Cruise, he worked for a special police unit in the future where they're able to arrest murderers before they actually commit their crimes. The stakes are raised for him when he is accused of a future murder and must race against time to resolve things before they spin out of control. Internal stakes are typically psychological. What will your character lose or gain emotionally or mentally? Does it have to do with pride? Is it insecurity? In the movie The Social Network, we see a young Mark Zuckerberg struggling socially. He may be a smart kid at Harvard, but he sure doesn't seem to understand the value of friendship and personal relationships much in the movie. Throughout his journey, he is faced with the internal stakes that could leave him emotionally empty and alone in the end. Philosophical stakes is usually the argument that will span across the entire story. The stakes could be questions such as, will being a playboy and bachelor make me happy? Or will love conquer greed? Or even something like, can war actually bring peace? So as you're developing your character, keep in mind the stakes that are always at hand. This is what's going to keep the reader turning the page and also what's going to keep the audience watching minute by minute and help develop that tension that's going to keep them on the edge of their seats. All right, now that you understand stakes and goals, let's talk about how you can balance the stakes and goals. All characters in a story are driven by motivations, right? So they have desires and goals that need fulfillment. A good writer can develop those goals to create enjoyable tension and momentum. However, motivation isn't all there is to character development. There's the counterpart, those being the stakes. Motivations are seen as positive goals we move to. But sometimes a story can be driven by negative outcomes a character wants to avoid. When combining stakes and motivations, a writer adds a new level of depth to the narrative. Understanding viable motivations and stakes. Let's start with the motivations here. Part of the human experience is aiming for what we lack. This can range from luxury items like a big house to some type of experience like free time or a special lover. They can even be collective goals like world domination, a mission, social service, etc., etc. Stakes follow a similar route. There are personal outcomes/stakes that we don't want. There are also communal negatives that a character may want to avoid. Many writers use stakes for world building and before slowly introducing character goals. So stakes can become more interesting when not reaching the goal has very serious consequences. That is, there should be a risk as a character chases their desires. We talked about that when we discussed stakes. Now, stakes become more interesting when not reaching the goal has serious consequences. That is, there should be risk as a character chases their desires, and risk builds tension. Risk also maximizes that sense of urgency. It allows the readers to relate more and hooks them deeper into the story. Readers and audience members, I'm going to use that interchangeably for those who are only trying to write scripts versus those of us who want to see our scripts made or make them ourselves. So, for example, a character's goal can be to land an important job, for instance. Not doing so can have disastrous consequences, ranging from poverty to loss of social prestige. Basically, as a writer, you should combine motivations and stakes to flesh out a character's psyche. Now let's talk about how to raise the stakes. Occasionally, you should remind a reader of the stakes that a character has to face. There's no better way than raising the stakes. Building up the level of danger creates even more anticipation for what's going to happen next. The heightened stakes should be relatable too, and dodging them should be a heroic feat. You can raise the stakes for a character by doing a couple of things. Number one, you can increase the quantity. For example, stories about gamblers can raise the stakes by introducing colossal betting circles. The second way to do this is meaning. You can elaborate on what winning or losing actually means to this character. For a gambler, this can mean paying off debts, winning money for a certain cause, etc., etc. You'll need to come up with your own ideas. Now let's talk about introducing stakes on a micro level. Core character stakes aren't all there is to a story. You should introduce minor negatives throughout the story. Those can be minor setbacks through scenes. Those setbacks add further definition to a character. It displays their strongest and weakest traits. Those traits can be psychological, emotional, financial, or even philosophical. Each setback helps readers or audience members understand a character even more. It lets them see better how they view and relate to that character in a story. But beware, developing good stakes is an act of cruelty if you think about it. You'll need to place your characters in situations that rob them of their security. And that security isn't just financial. It can just be emotional. But let's break down those stakes even further when I say that. All right, so here's 3 different types of stakes. Number 1, fear. Ask what a character fears and why. Try to focus on emotional fears, which may tie into physical ones. For example, does a character fear dying alone? Maybe commitment spooks the hell out of them. Maybe they're afraid of commitment to someone who ignores and doesn't value them. You don't need to give your character a long laundry list. Just 3 will suffice. Then go deeper and analyze how those fears developed in the past. Number 2 are flaws. Characters aren't supposed to be free of error. Remember, nobody's perfect. I'm sure you've heard that saying throughout your entire life. Well, your characters that you're writing are no different. They should have irks that get them into trouble, but not too much. Now, define your character's flaws well. This can be a quick temper or a sense of arrogance or just some type of tick. Maybe greed is a driving force. Flaws don't need to be universally bad though. Remember that. They can be traits that are negative from a character's point of view, but not others. For example, that may include social awkwardness, identity problems, the list can go on. But it's best if you imply those traits subtly throughout the story. Don't dump everything on the audience members all at once. Also, try to define how well the character is at seeing their own errors. Reflection and self-analysis should be a key component of all of your character's development. Number 3 comes remorse. Some characters are driven by a nagging conscience or a sense of unfulfilled duty. Ask if your character has any wishes to fix their past actions. Maybe they did something they wish they hadn't. Try to come up with 2 events that the character regrets. Elaborate on those actions they take to prevent those situations from occurring again. Character wants versus character needs. Now, the characters in any movie are the driving force to making a compelling experience. We all know this. When you can clearly show what a character's want and need is in a story, you will find that you've created something people will actually remember. Let's start with defining what the want is for a character. Okay, imagine you want to spend your last $5 on lottery tickets because the jackpot is at an all-time record high. But what you really need that money for is bus fare in order to get home across town before some predicted snowstorm begins. Your protagonist will have the same push-pull between two desires, but their conflict will be based around their own story. Ultimately, the decisions they make will dictate their character arc. The want is something your character desires because in their mind, it's going to give them happiness or a better quality of life. The need is the actual lesson that your character will learn in order to overcome their emotional conflict, which is directly tied to the physical conflict in the story. It will also tie the character to the plot. So you can see why really having a clear want and need is critical to the overall story you're telling. The want is that thing your character believes will free them from their problems, and the need is what they will actually learn and grow from. Your character's preoccupation with their want will create the fundamental flaw. In the movie Liar Liar, Jim Carrey's character as a dishonest attorney was so good at lying for a living that he unintentionally broke his young son's heart by doing the same thing in their father-son relationship. In order to get ahead in his career, Jim Carrey believed that he needed to be dishonest and say whatever he needed to say just to maintain his reputation as the best defense attorney in the state. His want was to win a major upcoming case that would drastically propel his career at the firm. The character was so preoccupied with his want that he didn't even realize he was losing the one thing he truly needed, which was his son, who was clearly the only thing in his life that actually made him happy. Now, it's not until a mysterious event takes place that hinders Jim Carrey's character from being able to tell a lie that he begins to discover what his true need is. His son had made a wish that his father could not tell a lie for one full day, and it just so happens that this took effect on the day his father had the biggest case of his career, in which his game plan was basically to lie in order to win. Simultaneously in the story, the main character was struggling with his ex-wife moving to another state and taking their son with her in order to protect him from all the broken promises Jim Carrey's character had made over the years. The main character learns a lot throughout the course of the day, where he suffers the harsh reality of just not being able to constantly lie to do his job. Even though he still manages to win the big court case, it results in a woman winning custody and child support from her rich husband solely for the reasons of being a gold digger. When the man's children are literally ripped away from his arms in court and crying, Jim Carrey has a major realization at this point of what it might be like to lose his own son. So this is the moment where he values his need over his previous wants. From this point on, he struggles to win his son's trust back by any means necessary before he gets on an airplane with his mom, later leaving that evening. At some point, your character also will have to face their flaw and face the consequences of their choice, just like Jim Carrey did when he spent all of his time trying to lie for the purposes of winning a big case instead of repairing his relationship with his son before it was too late. Now, at some point, your character is going to have to face their flaw and face the consequences of their choice, just like Jim Carrey did when he spent all of his time trying to lie for the purposes of winning a big case instead of repairing his relationship with his son before it was too late. By combining the character's want and the need, you're going to end up with a great character arc that shows obvious growth from start to finish. So, when developing your main character, work out what he or she wants versus what they actually need. Make sure to be aware of how the two are connected also. Also be aware or figure out how their want creates their flaw. And finally, make sure to show us how their choice between the want and need leads to a consequence or some type of outcome. Okay, so we've talked about character goals. We've talked about character stakes. What we haven't talked about yet are the obstacles that you're going to put in your character's way to make it hard for them to achieve their goals. Here's 5 ways that will make things easier on how you can create obstacles for your character development. So, developing your character means introducing challenges. That's just part of the game. You need to raise the stakes and add tension. We've already talked about that. Now, challenges are what are going to do that job well, especially if they relate to your main storyline. These challenges or obstacles should create a risk that pushes your character off their journey. It takes them and distracts them away from their goal. Let's discuss 5 purposes you should keep in mind when creating these challenges for your character. Number 1, let obstacles show a character's motivation. You should have your character's motivations mapped out as you write your story. Then you should add the obstacles that slowly reveal their motivations and true intentions. However, mapping out character motivation isn't easy. It involves a lot of factors like mannerisms, the details on their personality traits, maybe even the physical appearance, life story, struggles, backstory, things like that. Obviously, all those factors aren't revealed at the start of the story. They just sort of ooze out as we go along in the story. Challenges will slowly showcase them one by one. This will make your character a lot more relatable. Number 2, mix multiple obstacles to add tension. You can have physical obstacles too if that works best for your story. Those may be people or objects in a character's way, or even invisible forces. Mixing both leaves readers in a state of anticipation. This is going to add depth to your story and makes them speculate, which gives the story that tension. Doing that is easy. You can mix a character's internal struggles with an external physical obstacle that challenges them. Now you've created a natural conflict your character must face in order to get to the next step in their journey. You can also have a situation where the character's belief is challenged, maybe by a stronger opposition. For example, maybe your main character is a priest who loses his faith in God after his son is brutally murdered and the killer walks away free on a technicality. Number 3, let subplots add complexity. Subplots are just side challenges that tie into the main story. You can use them for your character development as well without relying on the main plot. From there, let the storyline be a place where the character tests their new selves. Those subplots may be minor villains or stories within the grand plot. They may be preliminary challenges for the character to face the story's bigger challenges. Number 4, challenge your antagonist too. Give the bad guys a challenge. Your main character isn't the only character that should be going through hell and back. Your main character obviously needs complexity, but so should the antagonist. You can try to flesh out the antagonist's motivations. This will give readers insight, maybe even empathy into the antagonist's goals as well. You can add challenges to slow down their success rate. This should create a sense of excitability that makes readers want to explore more. Number 5, make character obstacles transformative. You can add a series of non-stop obstacles that push your character to their limits. Remember John Wick? He had one simple goal, but look at all the hell he had to go through just to get there. Dedicate an entire arc to those obstacles. Make it a goal to use that arc for character transformation. Try to bring the character to a new state that'll serve them further in the story. It'll make them more interested and more memorable. Creating character arcs, the basics. The cinematic universe has given us some exceptionally great characters and stories that have been seared into our minds. Take the fictional lives of Harry Potter or Indiana Jones. Who doesn't want their worlds to be real? A school of magic, friendly-ish ghosts, and heartwarming friendships, or never-ending escapades with a couple of athletic history/archaeology buffs. Let's not forget about the dark masterpieces that were Walter White from the television show Breaking Bad and Michael Corleone from the movie Godfather. What do most epic movies or characters that people never forget have in common? Most of the time, it's the flawless character arcs. Can you imagine Harry Potter not being an orphan or having a happy childhood with his aunt's family? Or Walter White from the television show Breaking Bad not having cancer and not starting from rock bottom in season 1? Nope, of course not. That would change a major aspect of their personalities, directly affecting the storyline and how people perceive them. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that Harry Potter or Breaking Bad wouldn't be mega successes if their lead characters, or supporting ones too, were any different. Creating a simple character arc can be perplexing enough, but to imagine a strong and unique persona can be tough, but not impossible. While there's a lot to consider when thinking of your protagonist or any personality in your story, you don't always need a dramatic character arc to attract an audience. Indiana Jones and Sherlock Holmes are perhaps one of the best examples of a static character arc. So, the question for aspiring writers racking their brains to create their very own fictional world is, how do you create a great character arc? Well, let's start with talking about what a character arc actually is. So let's start from zero. How would you define a character arc? A character arc is the transformation a protagonist undergoes during the story. Character arcs are the difference between who your protagonist or any character is at the beginning and who they become at the end of your story. The start point and the end point in terms of personality or emotional maturity or even their general place in life. The arc will include various aspects that help the character reach that point, which usually has significant obstacles, dramatic plot twists, an adventure with friends, or enemies that shape the story and the character. The most common character arc may be a flawed persona becoming a good person, but that doesn't have to be the case always. Many movies are similar because their protagonist faces an internal or external significant obstacle that brings a fundamental change in them. The most memorable classics generally feature happy endings, with the character developing good skill sets and strengths that transfer him or her into a hero. You'll notice most characters don't start off as heroes, they develop into one. So let's talk about some different types of character arcs. There are several different types of character arcs, but they can be broadly divided as positive, negative, and flat. Positive character arcs are probably the most common and include all hero stories. Here, the main character will either be an average person or someone who has struggled a lot. A series of events would take them on an adventure facing a myriad of challenges, fighting off villains and evil forces while even becoming stronger. Eventually, they would probably become the perfect hero, rescuing everyone and getting the girl at the end of the day. The bigger the challenge, the more dramatic the arc. Other positive arcs would be bad guys turning good. Ebenezer Scrooge from the classic A Christmas Carol is a good example. Negative character arcs are the exact opposite of hero stories. Here, a previous hero or just a regular guy would get involved with the bad side or just end up on the wrong side of the tracks for some reason and turn into a complete villain by the end. Generally, we see villains with negative story arcs like Voldemort, Darth Vader, Black Adam, Two-Face from Batman, or Magneto from the X-Men series. The endings could be gloomy or they could be fun. However, we all know bad guys generally lose the fight. In the TV show Breaking Bad, that's a prime example of one of the most successful negative story character arcs. So let's talk about flat character arcs. While character arcs in general are essential to a story and attract an audience, you may not always need one. Several writers approach a story without changing much of the initial character sketch of the protagonist and still moving ahead with the actual adventure. Indiana Jones, Sherlock Holmes, and most superhero movies have flat character arcs. Most side or supporting roles can also be seen without much difference from the start to the end of a show or a movie. So don't always feel like you have to have a character arc in your story. It's not mandatory. Now that we understand what character arcs are, let's talk about how to create powerful character arcs. The best way to construct believable and relatable character development stories is by placing yourself in the protagonist's shoes and acting as an average person would. Of course, you would want to keep in mind the different personality traits they may have, but that is exactly what a good writer does. Start by asking yourself the following questions to build a skeleton of your character arc. Number 1, what are the wants or needs of my main goal, and why? A character arc evolves from a basic conscious or unconscious desire, which may be labeled as outer/inner goals or wants/needs. These ideas generally exist from the start of the story or are introduced early on and form the basis of the protagonist's journey. For example, the male lead could initially be motivated by girls or dating many girls at once, being a typical bad boy, and then realizing he's wrong and becoming a complete gentleman by the end of the story. So the motivation driving your character, being a good person, being a hero, adventuring with friends, whatever it might be, will warrant your whole plot. The desires of your lead will set the agenda for his goals and decide his future actions. Number 2, what is stopping him or her? You have your goal, your agenda, and your motivation. So what's stopping your lead from achieving all of that? This will form the barrier or obstacle your protagonist will have to face. Best-selling authors often recommend thrusting your characters into the most challenging situations as soon as you can to create a grasping storyline. The more impossible it might seem, the more dramatic the story will get. Number 3, what are the weaknesses of your character? Flaws are essential. They make a fictional character seem real and relatable. A perfect hero doesn't make for an exciting story. Every Superman needs his kryptonite, but make sure the character flaws aren't too extreme, or you'll end up with a villainish type of hero that the audience won't sympathize with unless that is exactly what you're going for. Number 4, your lead's internal monologuing is important. How do they talk to themselves? You have your hero, their goals, their problems or challenges, and something that drives them. This is what makes your character arc. But how will the audience know what's going on inside that imaginary mind of your character? The internal conflicts and the conversations a protagonist has inside their mind before deciding to reveal more about their actual character than the events. So start asking questions. How would John, your hypothetical character, react when the situation turns worse? What troubles John the most? What is John's current weakness? What are John's secrets? Questions directed to the internal thought process are crucial while writing your story and should be reflected in the dialogue. This will form a narration to the character arc. Number 5, the character arc and action should relate. You have your story, your protagonist, and arc ready to go, and you've included some insight on how your character thinks and acts through his or her thought process or their internal dialogue. You're right on track. But besides telling your audience that yes, John has grown, his arc development should show through his actions. Remember, the number one rule that we do count as a rule, probably the only rule in writing a script or screenplay, is show, don't tell. Resist explaining every detail and show it all through your character's actions. Let's say John was going from a nerd to a hero. He wouldn't just talk a hole in your head and tell you about it. Naturally, he should act braver, speak up more, be assertive, and jump in to save the day throughout your story. And last but not least, the arc's finale. The character arcs need to have some type of conclusion unless you choose to go with a flat and static John. In the end, if we're talking about the lead, a supporting role, or the villain, their progress and growth should lead somewhere. And with that, you have written your whole story, you've created an impressive character arc, and you're ready to go off to the next chapter. Using character tropes and archetypes to your advantage. Character tropes and archetypes refer to common traits or attributes that are found across a bunch of different characters. The word trope means a common motif or pattern in a work of art. The word archetype has Greek origin in meaning with arche. I think I said that right. But being defined as beginning, origin, and typos, meaning pattern, model, or type. You get the picture. So you can see how these words can be used interchangeably. There are certain genres of storytelling that rely on particular character tropes and archetypes more than others. You've seen and heard of characters in movies who were considered the chosen one, or the mad scientist, or the mentor, or the girl next door. But what do they really mean when they say that? Check out this video I did a while ago with some additional insight and examples on exactly what that means. So first off, what is a character archetype? Character archetypes are basically stock characters that have basic guidelines for characterization. So think of character archetypes as character tropes. Tropes are similar to cliches, but the difference is that cliches have more of a negative label, while tropes are what you would expect to see in a certain type of character or movie. For example, the hero, the seducer, the sage, these are all examples of character archetypes that you're probably familiar with. But in any given movie, the details about these characters will set them apart, which is why it wouldn't be fair to kind of consider these cliche, which is an idea, event, or detail that's been done so many times that it's predictable or just whack. So let's start with our first example, the hero. The hero is the character in your story, obviously, that will rise to the occasion and save the world, save something, save someone. This character is usually known for having honor and courage at the very least. It may not be at the start of the story, but they eventually develop it. So some common weaknesses with the hero are arrogance or being stubborn. Think about Simba from The Lion King, Luke Skywalker, Indiana Jones, Spider-Man, Neo from The Matrix, The Incredibles, Frodo from The Lord of the Rings. These were all heroes that didn't necessarily start out as heroes, but they did over time kind of develop those traits as they realized and came into their character. Now, one thing I want to caveat about character archetypes is that these characters that I'm naming, they're not just one thing. You can mix and match these character archetypes to make people or your characters be unique, because people in real life are not just one thing. People are complex human beings. They're three-dimensional. So these examples that I'm giving you, just keep in mind that you can kind of mix and match them and think of them as just like a starting point. You know, if you got a blank slate and you don't have any idea of, you know, what types of characters should belong in your story. Moving on. The Dark Knight is a character archetype that is good to be opposite to the hero of your story. This is a character who fights for what we generally might consider the wrong side, but typically their reasons for doing so are things that we can empathize with and realize that they're not just an evil psychopath. We might not agree with their reasoning, but we understand why they feel the way they do, or why they have a certain type of belief system. So, for example, Two-Face, aka Harvey Dent in The Dark Knight, he's basically a villain, but we understand why he became a villain and how he started off in his journey and why he has that point of view. We may not agree with it, but it is what it is. Darth Vader is another one. Amy Dunn from Gone Girl, Magneto from X-Men. You can think about his perspective versus Professor Xavier's perspective on, attacking humans versus not attacking humans, and, living in peace versus just kind of doing their own thing and, being considered the dominant race, or whatever. Thanos from Avengers is another good example of his point of view on things as being the Dark Knight. Another character archetype that we're going to talk about is the Jester. Now, this is basically what it sounds like. It's the comic relief in the story. this character archetype, they're either the butt of the jokes or they are making someone else the butt of their jokes. At times, they might deliver an important truth to the protagonist, but it just all depends on your story. The thing I will say about the jester is that they don't have to be silly as hell all the time. Like, it doesn't have to be over the top, just like a class clown 100% of the time. However, being obnoxious typically serves as this character archetype's weakness. So Deadpool would be a good example of this particular character archetype, even though he also has a hero and leader type of character archetype. So he's not just one thing. Alan from The Hangover might be a better example, because that's pretty much all he is the comic relief, the jester. Saul from Breaking Bad is another good example. And Paulie Walnuts from The Sopranos, the show, if you remember that. Game of Thrones, I would probably say Bronn. He's got more of a sarcastic type of comic relief going on, but he cracks jokes, Now, the final character archetype we're going to be talking about is the sage. This is the wise character in the story. So they serve more as a mentor or father figure or mother figure. They usually have the most experience or insight into matters, and those strengths also usually counter their weaknesses, which is a lot of times being overly cautious or too hesitant to take risks in situations where there's really no time to think things through logically. So this character archetype would be someone like Professor X from X-Men, the Oracle from The Matrix, Yoda, Morpheus, also fits that, Gandalf from The Lord of the Rings, and Mr. Miyagi from The Karate Kid. Well, that's pretty much it. I hope that clears things up. I like to use character archetypes sometimes when I just have like a blank paper and I'm just starting from scratch and I don't really have any idea. I'm just, throwing stuff down and just trying to get some rhythm going. So now that you have a good understanding of what archetypes are, let's talk about how you can use character tropes to your advantage. Tropes can be a great starting point for your characters when you're starting at a blank page and just have a general idea on where to begin. Say, for example, you were writing The Matrix. By now you can tell that I love that movie because I keep using it as an example. So let's pretend that you don't have Neo's character developed quite yet, but you know that you want your protagonist to be considered the chosen one. Additionally, let's pretend that you also know that somewhere in your story, he will have a nemesis and a mentor type of character in his life as well. Those characters eventually turn out to be Agent Smith as the nemesis and Morpheus as the mentor. So think of your character tropes and character archetypes as temporary placeholders. They are completely customizable and they need to be tailored specifically to your story. They simply serve as a good starting point, and think of them as a way to just fill in the blanks, add details as you see fit so that they become unique. So when should you avoid character tropes? A lot of times leaning too hard on a character trope will result in a typical character we've seen a million times over and over. This typically happens because you either don't know your character well enough and are relying on the first thing that comes to mind, or you haven't developed them thoroughly enough. If your characters do what the typical movie person would always do in that situation, then you need to burn that scene and rewrite it. The last thing the audience wants to see is something we've already seen 100 times before. And the quickest way to get that subpar result is to not detail your character trope or archetype enough so that it is personable and it feels like it's something that is tailor-made for your particular story. Now, surprise, you've got an assignment for this particular module. So this is what I want you to do. Think of your protagonist, the overall story or idea, and write down which character archetype he or she fits closest to. If you haven't begun working on developing your character, choose from a list of character archetypes. Use it as a starting point and add on to it or mix and match with a couple of other tropes. Now, how would you describe this person? And again, this is just a starting point. This is not anything that you want to sort of take and just run with it. You want to make sure you add all the necessary and relevant details to these particular characters so that they're personable, customizable, and just feel tailor-made for your particular story. So far, everything we've talked about with character development is related directly to your story and how it's going to be hard for them to achieve their goal and to make things more suspenseful. And now we're going to talk about something that's just as important, and that's making your character three-dimensional. What that means is giving your character a three-dimensional feel so that they don't feel one-dimensional or two-dimensional, which is pretty much like a stock character, or making it seem as though they were only created just for this particular movie. Consider who your favorite characters are. Who's the first character that comes to mind? Now, think of 3 of your favorite movie or TV characters. What do you think attracted you to them in terms of interest? What makes them unique? In the TV show The Wire, Stringer Bell, a drug dealer, recites Greek mythology and goes to night school for business. Dr. Hannibal Lecter in The Silence of the Lambs is a serial killer who eats people, but used to be a highly respected forensic psychiatrist who is also very intelligent. He also has refined taste and impeccable manners. In the movie Lethal Weapon, Martin Riggs is a suicidal detective who throws himself into situations where he doesn't seem to care if he lives or dies. These are the types of characters who actors love to play because these characters feel like extraordinary people. The characters are layered. They are not just one way or can be described in one word. They're three-dimensional. Your character should be complex because that's how people are in real life. People lie, they contradict themselves, they have hard beliefs, thoughts, concerns, fears, and so should your main characters. Ask yourself these questions about your protagonist that you have in mind. What does he or she love? What do they hate? What is their biggest fear? What do they believe in wholeheartedly? What are their core values? What is it that they want in life the most? Do they have a special skill? Who's the most important person in their life? What's the biggest decision they've had to make in their life up to this point? Now, even if some of these things don't actually come out in the story, you should know them and be able to speak to them in regard to your character. These are the details that make your character memorable and not feel like something people actually will fall asleep on. A good exercise to discover who your character is once you have defined the type of world they're going to live in is to think of how they would react in a few different scenarios. For example, if your character is known for being a thrill seeker, then how would they handle being in a life or death situation like being robbed at gunpoint? Would they take a chance at getting away instead of just surrendering? Or how would a scenario play out if your character was homophobic and got stuck in an elevator with the leader of a popular LGBT organization? The key to writing a good three-dimensional character is to try and give them 2 to 3 conflicting dimensions. The first dimension can be associated with their personal life. This could be how they spend their time, what their most noticeable trait is, or how they are known socially. For example, John is on the brink of bankruptcy and his family doesn't know. Sarah is a sociopath. Brian is a thrill seeker. The second dimension would be more related to how they make a living or their occupation. John works as an accountant for the mob. Sarah is a popular dating coach. Brian is a politician. You can see how these traits are already beginning to make our characters slightly interesting right off the bat. The third dimension is the inner character trait that your character is trying to hide from the world. It's that additional thing that makes your character unique to the story. This trait is the third dimension. It shouldn't just be anything that you sort of pick out of a hat. It should be connected to the first 2 traits in a way where it makes sense. John is a thief. Sarah hates men. Brian wants to know what it's like to kill someone. So if you put all that together, we've now got three characters that are three-dimensional and are pretty well-rounded. A good starting point. So let's take a look at what we just kind of threw out there. The first character I talked about that I just made up, John. He's on the brink of bankruptcy and his family doesn't know. He also works as an accountant for the mob. And the thing that makes him unique is that he's a thief. Now let's look at the second character that we talked about, Sarah. She's a sociopath. She's also a popular dating coach, so she's out here giving folks advice. And then on top of that, she secretly hates men. So how do you think that plays out? And our last character that we just made up, Brian, he's a thrill seeker and he's a politician. And then on top of that, Brian wants to know what it's like to kill someone. Curiosity. Or better yet, let's say he's a longtime serial killer who police and FBI have been chasing for decades. Or he's a vigilante and he kills people in a way where it contradicts his actual political beliefs. Now, these are just examples I made up off the top of my head for the purposes of this exercise, but the idea is that you want to give your characters contradicting traits because people in general are contradicting, and you want to make sure that at least one of those traits are very unique. If you think back on some of the most memorable characters of all time in movies and television shows, you'll find that they have at least three traits that make them well-rounded. A hitman is not just a hitman. A misogynist is not just a misogynist. The most popular famous priest in a small town who's loved and well respected is not just that. I think you get the gist at this point, but if you do this well, you'll have unique, memorable characters that people won't forget. At some point, you may want to create a backstory for your character, or you may even want to start with this process depending on how you work. The purpose of the backstory is to develop fully formed characters who resemble real people. We want to make sure that they're not like stock characters. We want them to feel as real as possible, just like the average person you might meet or already know. The work you do here is meant to inform the action of your overall story. So always keep in mind that this is something that is flexible and can change as you begin to piece things together. Never feel like once you've created the backstory that you're just locked into it. The character's backstory is a document you can create in any kind of format you want. There may even be a lot of details or events that don't even make it into your screenplay, and that's perfectly okay. The more you know about your characters, the easier it will be to finish a scene and make decisions on your writing journey. In the chapter where we discussed how to create a three-dimensional character, we also discussed asking yourself a series of questions about your character. What does he or she love? What do they hate? What is their biggest fear? What do they believe in wholeheartedly? What are their core values? What is it that they want in life the most? Do they have a special skill? Who's the most important person in their life? What's the biggest decision they've had to make in their life up to this point? These are all things that can be discovered in the backstory as you write. Just make sure that everything you're including in the backstory is relevant to the movie that you're actually writing. Here's a few ways you can handle your character's backstory. Number 1, try writing out a few scenes in screenwriting format. If your character had a tragic event in their life that dictates how they handle their problems, write all of that out. Don't just say, ever since John lost his little brother to a car accident, he stopped talking. A single page could be all you need to visualize how things played out for your character. Did John hear about the loss of his brother in an accident, or was he right there with him and his brother died in his arms? Obviously, one has a more traumatic effect than the other. So here's a second way. Even if you haven't figured out your plot yet, writing a character's backstory is still a good way to discover the plot. As you write out the important things in your character's life, you'll most likely create some supporting characters and add conflict to their relationships. Using the previous example, what if John's wife gave his little brother the beer that served as a catalyst to him actually being in an accident? Now, she didn't know he was a recovering alcoholic and was about to get behind the wheel, or did she? You see, there's several ways to create conflict throughout the story from that scenario alone. And keep in mind, all of this is happening before the movie even starts. Now, here's a third way to create a backstory. Create some cause and effect scenarios for your character to get you going in the right direction. If your character, Maria, stole a candy bar from the grocery store at the age of 12 based on a dare from her sister, maybe the effect was that she got caught by a man pretending to be the security guard and kidnapped her. She eventually escapes, but as an adult, she always blamed her sister subconsciously, and that's just one of 50 reasons why they're always at odds. You ever think of some of your favorite movies and wonder why the characters just feel so complete? This is one of the reasons why. Before the movies even started, they've got a backstory. They've got conflict, they've got complications, they've got all types of things that they've dealt with before page one. Let's take a real simple example, Han Solo from Star Wars. He's a smuggler, right? He didn't become a smuggler once the movie had just started for Star Wars. He was always a smuggler. He didn't become a rebel who joined forces with the others to defeat the evil Galactic Empire until the movie started. Prior to that, he was already stuck in his ways. He had a life before the whole movie started. Think of some of your favorite characters in any movie that you can think of and just kind of take that main character and see if you can figure out what was this character probably like before the movie started? What was their backstory? How did they become who they are? 9 times out of 10, the writer has probably answered some of these questions we're talking about before they even started the actual story. Now, most great stories are going to have a protagonist and a strong villain or antagonist. Even though your story is going to most likely focus on the hero or the villain, having a strong supporting character or characters are also going to play a big role in making your story actually feel like a real thing. Your supporting characters can be used in a lot of different ways. Sometimes they're used just to flesh out the main character or even expose certain character traits. The one thing they are most useful for is creating conflict. And as we've already discussed before, conflict will be the main ingredient that keeps your story alive. So, what are some great examples of supporting characters? You know we have to talk about that. Luna Lovegood from Harry Potter is not just a chapter in the Deathly Hallows, but it could be argued that this character could be an actual spin-off. And do you remember Oren Ishii, played by Lucy Liu in the movie Kill Bill? In that movie, she had told a compelling backstory of how her parents were murdered and how that led up to her becoming a ruthless crime assassin. And the genie from the movie Aladdin is a character who is so interesting. You just have to wonder why nobody has even written this standalone movie about him yet. When you think about the movie Deadpool 2, aside from Deadpool himself, the character called Domino pretty much stole the show in the action scenes. And who could ever forget Samwise from the movie Lord of the Rings? He's a perfect example of what a secondary character's role is. Now, these are just the tip of the iceberg of memorable supporting characters in movies that have been well received. Their presence doesn't always have to be so strong that you could write a standalone movie about them, but they do need to serve a strong purpose within your story. Now let's talk about 2 main categories of supporting characters. Remember, your supporting characters need to serve a purpose in your story, and that can be anything from being a love interest to a bestie, a mentor, or whatever. Here's 2 different types of purposes that your supporting characters may serve in the story. The first, they could be antagonizers. Now, this doesn't mean that they are two-faced or secretly working for the villain, but some people, even in real life, can make situations a lot worse than what they really are. This will create conflict, and that could easily be one of the things that makes your story take a turn for the worse when you need it. On the flip side of things, these antagonizers could very well have ill intentions and turn against your protagonist. The second category is that your supporting character could be a supporter. Now, when your hero is at his or her lowest point in the story, ask yourself, who do they turn to for motivation or help? In the movie The Matrix, the Oracle and Morpheus told Neo exactly what he needed to hear at just the right moments. Even Superman had Lois Lane and his mother to give him emotional support whenever he was having doubts about his role amongst the human race. Now, who does your main character turn to for advice or help? So here's 5 things to keep in mind about supporting characters overall. Number 1, make sure you don't create too many supporting characters. Your audience will get confused at who does what and who's who if there are a dozen people they need to remember in order to understand your story. Number 2, give them different personalities. Avoid cliche characters that we've seen before. They can be familiar, but make sure to give them a characteristic that makes them stand on their own so the audience won't dread their presence. Number 3, make sure to make them 3-dimensional also, just like your main character. We want these characters to feel like they are real people and not just in the movie to do one thing. Number 4, make sure they are unpredictable. Nobody wants to watch characters they think they already know. Now keep in mind your audience, when they're watching your movie, they're going to be trying to figure things out as they go sometimes. Have your supporting characters do something unpredictable at some point. This will just aid in the plot twist, or it could even serve as the plot twist depending on your story. Number 5, use memorable names we can remember. Your audience will be focused on your protagonist and the villain. So when the supporting characters show up on screen, it's important that their names are easy to understand and remember in the event that they're referenced later in the story without being on screen.